Hi, I'm Angelo John Lewis for the Sacred Inclusion Network. And if you're not familiar with the network, we're a group of people that are spiritual but not religious, and we want to change the world in a positive way. And if you want to know more about us, the simplest way to go to our website, sacredinclusion.com. Today, it's my enormous pleasure to interview Dr. Jeffrey John Kripal, the J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. Jeff's work includes the study of comparative erotics and ethics in mystical literature, the American counterculture, and the history of Western esotericism from Gnosticism to New Age religions. He's the author of many books, including Authors of the Impossible, the Paranormal, and the Sacred, Esalen, America and the Religion of New Religions, and my favorite, a very short volume by Jeffrey Standards called The Flip. He's also the convener of something called the Archives of the Impossible, which is an actual archive and conference to be held in early March 2022. And we're going to talk about the project in some detail, but I wanted to just tell you that for a number of years, at least for a year, graduate students have been assembling a massive archive of material about paranormal activity that are going to be collected in this archive. And I would like to just quote one particular description of it, which is on Kripal's website. Such a project is based on the wager that new theory has been hidden in the anomalous, that the paranormal appears in order to mock and shock us out of our present and normal thinking. Seen in this way, psychical and paranormal phenomena become the still unacknowledged, unassimilated other of modern thought, and the still unrealized future of theory, the fleeting signs of a consciousness not yet become a culture. Quite a buildup. Welcome, Dr. Kripal, or
Thank
Jeff.
you. Yeah, no, just call me Jeff, and thanks for having me, Angelo.
Oh, it's my enormous pleasure. So I have to say to start off, when I talk to academics, and I worked at Princeton University for 3.5 years, most of the times they're talking about very material things, with a few exceptions. Now you're in religion, which is a little bit of a not. I mean, it's not biochemistry. Let's put it that way. But in any event, you've got this interest in the paranormal. So I just thought we'd start out with an easy question: how did you become interested in the paranormal?
Yeah, well, there's a short story and a long story always. I'll try to tell a shorter story. The truth is, I wasn't. My early work was really focused on more traditional academic questions that are very material in orientation, like sexuality and gender. But I was also really interested in mystical literature. So I was always interested in the extreme, or the sort of the radical, kind of far end of religious experience. And I always knew about these sort of miracles or special abilities of individuals, but we were trained essentially in the 80s and early 90s to ignore those, or to consider them as legends or as exaggerations towards some kind of power play. You claimed a miracle or a special ability because you were claiming some authority, or you were trying to build up some kind of institution or social movement. Sometime in the early turn of the millennium, I was studying the American counterculture, actually, out in California, and I was talking to lots of people whom I got to know very well, and they were telling me crazy stories that I had to conclude were crazy, but actually happened. And I was really stunned by that. Because I had been trained to think otherwise. And I realized these people were not exaggerating. They were not lying. They were not deluded. They were not misperceiving anything. And yet these experiences didn't fit in any way into the study of religion or the humanities, or much less the social sciences or the natural sciences. And so as an intellectual, I'm sort of trained to look for the anomalous anyway, to look for something that doesn't fit, because that's usually the most interesting piece to look at. And so I got really interested in why intellectuals were being so dishonest, frankly, about this stuff. And that I wrote a book called Authors of the Impossible in 2010, which was essentially an intellectual history of the paranormal. And that's really when my interests developed, right around then. And, I've sort of never let that bone go, been like a dog with a bone, just keep chawing on it. And I find it immensely productive, actually, intellectually and spiritually.
You mentioned the time period of the late '90s and early 2000s. I'm old enough to remember when the paranormal was a semi-respectable field in the academy. I'm thinking in places like the parapsychology laboratory at Duke University, which the university later defunded and established itself as the Ryan Research Center. And back in the '90s, I interviewed a fellow who was the author of this book. I don't know if you can see it. His name is Robert J. John.
Yeah.
And his history is very interesting because he's the former dean of engineering at Princeton University. But for some reason, he became the founder of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab at Princeton. And he was slammed at Princeton. Basically, many people considered him an embarrassment to the university because he was funded and they couldn't do anything about him. He had tenure. I mean, he was a former chairman of the engineering department of all things, right? I think maybe even been aerospace. I forget, but something very, very hardcore material. Yeah. Anyway, he was vilified at Princeton. And I was just wondering, given the history of this and the fact that it was sort of on the fringes of the academy, what happened to make these sort of inquiries sort of taboo?
Well, that's okay. So that's the question I try to answer in the book, Authors of the Impossible. And essentially what I learned, I mean, I didn't know this before I started that book, was the psychical, the paranormal, the parapsychological, these were all words that were coined more or less in the late 19th, early 20th century. They were part of modernity, what we call modernity. And they were all coined by scientists and intellectuals, believe it or not. They did not originate in the tabloids or in entertainment. They all originated in the universities. And so these questions were kind of central to intellectuals and scientists in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then essentially what happened was a whole series of movements. One was behaviorism, the kind of movement of psychology away from internal states of mind to externally measured behaviors. Another was computer modeling of the brain and the idea that the brain was really just a kind of biological computer. And just the rise of materialism or physicalism across the board in the sciences, social sciences, and the humanities, which essentially just argued that the human being is a biological or social animal, and it might have these religious beliefs, but they're always going to serve some social or political purpose. They're really unconsciously aimed at material ends. There's nothing transcendent. There's nothing spiritual. There's nothing special about a human being. We're essentially just a dying animal that's trying to convince itself otherwise. So, there were a lot, what I'm trying to say, there were a lot of reasons that what was once sort of foregrounded then became backgrounded and eventually became taboo and a kind of embarrassment. John is really interesting. Robert John at Princeton is an interesting case. He's like a lot of other cases, Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, for example, or J.B. Ryan at Duke University. These are all really kind of singular intellectuals who attract money from individual donors, but are not able to essentially make the inquiry stick in a discipline that can be carried on from generation to generation with journals and graduate students and funding and that sort of thing. It's not to blame them, Angelo. I'm just saying that's why this discipline has never really got its feet, academically. And there's a lot of other reasons we can talk about if you want, but that's essentially the quick answer to your question.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't say this, but it's like sort of like the rise of materialism. And in the academy, it was almost, I was there writing grants for these kind of people, not these kind of, but academics. And anything what people wanted to talk about with things like structural cell biology. The humanities that was sort of a fluffy thing. Seriously, that was kind of how it was thought of.
Well, it still is. It still is considered that by people who don't know better. But there is a kind of growing humility in the sciences around consciousness or mind, and a kind of growing awareness or admission that actually none of the material models work. And so consciousness or subjectivity is becoming kind of a wall, essentially, that neuroscience and the sciences in general are running into. And they're beginning to realize you can't ever really understand, particularly us, without taking seriously something like consciousness, that it doesn't seem to have any material or physical cause. And that's very disconcerting to them. But I think it's also for scientists who are courageous and who are frankly good scientists, that's also liberating and delicious in a particular kind of intellectual way, because it pushes you into another paradigm.
Not to belabor John, but one of the most interesting things he told me, because he was doing pretty conventional stuff, like, in other words, like he'd have somebody behind a curtain, and they're holding a deck of cards, and they're thinking this is a spade. And if you think that that's a spade, then maybe you're a little bit more psychic. But anyway, what he told me was that the reaction to what he was doing was in some ways more interesting than what he was doing itself. Okay. So he had I think four Nobel Prize winners at Princeton, two of whom thought he was what he was doing was great. The rest of them trashed him on every possible occasion that they could. Whenever they see his name in print, they would just trash him. Anyway, it's just interesting to me.
Yeah. There's a kind of, you protest too much kind of observation. Like what is this reaction, and where is it coming from? And it seems overblown and overdone.
He would say the only conclusion I could come to is that what I'm doing is shakes their ego to the core.
Yeah. I agree. I think he was right about that.
Now, I've just reread your book, The Flip, which I just think it's a wonderful book. Everyone should read it. I think it's a very, very important contribution to the universe of discourse, I'll call it. But in any event, you talk about this phenomenon you call the flip, which is a reversal of perspective from looking at reality from the outside in to the inside out. And then, interestingly, not just in this book, but in some of your other books, you talk about how other scientists and prominent intellectuals experience their own flips in perspective. I wonder if you could share a few stories of some of these people that our listeners might have no idea. They'll know who the people are, but they would not know necessarily that they themselves experience what you call the flip.
Well, yeah. So, a flip is essentially, you start out as a physicalist or a materialist. You think everything's matter, and physics is going to explain everything, and so you're looking from the inside out, and you're only recognizing this sort of external view. There are objects out there in three-dimensional space, and they can be measured and predicted. The flip is when, you go from the outside in, and you realize there's an interiority to reality, and that consciousness itself, or your own awareness, shares in that interiority, and that it's primary, and that these external objects out there are really always observations of this interiority or this form of consciousness. I look at dozens of scientists and engineers. I mean, the two that come to my mind, just the top of my head, are Bernardo Kastrup, who is a computer scientist, a Dutch computer scientist, who was very involved in the development of artificial intelligence and the notion that somehow if you made a computer that was sophisticated enough that it would suddenly become conscious. And of course, the premise there is that consciousness is a product of material processes. Well, Bernardo had a whole series of these flipped experiences, and he realized that actually mind or consciousness is primary and the material world is secondary. And so he's very much a critic now of this notion that a computer can ever become conscious. The computer, of course, can mimic cognition and thinking, but it can never become conscious because consciousness isn't produced by anything material. So Bernardo's one. Another is Barbara Ehrenreich, who is a very prominent feminist social critic in the U.S. here. And she wrote a book called Living with a Wild God a few years ago, in which she describes her flipped experience as a teenager, and in which she basically experienced the world as alive and as sort of not just alive, but fiercely flaming alive. And it essentially abducted her or possessed her as a teenage girl. And then she spent the rest of her life essentially hiding this flip because of her, I'm sure because of her social projects and her intellectual training. So, I mean, there's dozens of people in the book we could talk about like that, but they're essentially scientists or engineers or medical professionals who are trained to think about everything in a material way. And then they have a near-death experience or a psychedelic experience or a mystical experience, and they realize that earlier conviction is false and that the world is not primarily material, physical. It's actually there's a deeper source to it that is somehow tied up with our mind or our awareness.
Yeah, and you're mentioning relatively contemporary folks, but if you go back to the sort of like the history of science, a lot of these people had flipped experiences.
Oh yeah, and a good historian of science will tell you that, these sorts of experiences were never explained. They were never explained away, as some people want you to believe. They were just eventually ignored, and science went on to study what it can study, not what it can't. And so that's part of the problem today is we give so much authority to science because it can do so many cool things and so many important things, but there's so many things it can't do in principle, and we're not very good at admitting that or at just dealing with that.
So I read your book that you hopefully I don't mispronounce his name, but with Willie
Strieber.
Thank you, Strieber. I want to call him Stryber all the time, but that's not right.
It's okay.
And people don't know. If you're old enough, you may remember a movie called Communion, in which the backstory is that this person who's a well-known horror writer has what he may call an abduction experience. We could parse what he calls it and what he believes, but we won't get into that. But in any event, he's become kind of like the one of the main people and collector of these sort of anomalous experience. But in any event, in one portion of the book, you were grappling with how do we make sense of these sorts of incidents. In other words, we can't just put them under a microscope and do double-blind studies and things of that nature. And I remember you came up with several different ways to contextualize these experiences. And I don't want to get into a long discussion. We could talk about this all day. But I wonder if you could maybe talk about some ways that, let's say, more or less, well, how can we make sense of these in a way that will help us understand them? Because some of these things are just, who knows what the hell happened, right? But we have to figure out some sort of way, if we're humans and we're trying to understand them, how can we contextualize them?
Well, yeah, so you're talking about a book that Whitley and I wrote together called The Supernatural. Three words, the supernatural. And we're trying to make this argument that these anomalous events happen, but they're very much a part of the world. They're simply a part of the world we don't understand. And so we tend to interpret them religiously, but they're very much a part of reality. I think, there are many ways. There are many ways to interpret an abduction experience. I think the main move, though, that I try to make in that book is to explain the role of the imagination, and that when a human being encounters something in the environment, it encounters that presence through the medium of the imagination, its own imagination. And so the experience might look like it was imagined to a naive external viewer, but that actually doesn't mean it was not real. It means that the imagination has become a kind of translator or medium of this encounter experience. So something can be very much a function of the cultural imagination. Say you see a fairy if you're in 17th century England, or you see a jinn if you're in contemporary Iran, or you see an alien if you're in 21st century the US, because that's what your cultural imagination is trained to see. But you are actually probably encountering something that is communicating with you through your own imagination. So it's that kind of both and that I was trying to get across, Angelo, that we have to recognize our own role in shaping the experience, but we shouldn't conclude from that it's just in our heads and it's just purely subjective. That actually doesn't follow at all. And once you make that move, then you can contextualize modern abduction experiences in a millennia long history of human encounters with invisible entities. And you can explain both the differences, but also you can explain the similarities. And I think that's really the goal here, is to kind of embrace both.
Okay. I want to just ask you one question. Then we're going to talk about the conference and the archive. But I think this is an important subject, and I just want to hear you address it.
Let's see if I can. Let's just see what I say.
To me, one of the most moving parts of the book, when you talk very eloquently about what you call the future politics of knowledge.
Yeah.
And you begin that chapter in the book by saying, quote, "It matters how we think about consciousness in the cosmos." And I wonder if you can expand on your sense as to the ethical and moral implications and this change in perspective that you call the flip. Why does this matter?
Well, it matters because in our present culture, we have not flipped. Our present culture is not a flip culture. And so we imagine that Angelo or Jeff or Bill or Hussein or whoever it is, that their identity is primary, and that everything else flows from that identity. And so we feel separate from one another. You have your identity, I have mine, everyone else has everyone else's. Within a flip, what you realize is that the identities are important. The religious identities, the social identities, the political identities, the racial and the gendered sexual identities, those are all important things, but they're all built on top of a kind of shared humanity or a shared consciousness. And you begin to prioritize what we have in common and how we're the same. And you don't just prioritize how we're different. Because if we're fundamentally different, then that's going to result in social conflict and eventually social violence, because there's no reason we should get along. But if we're all fundamentally the same and our differences are in some ways surface differences, then the way I treat you is also the way I treat myself. I mean, we're really talking about a shared form of mind or consciousness here when we talk about the flip. So I don't think it automatically produces better politics or better ethics, Angelo. I think sometimes mystics and saints are really horrible people, frankly. So I don't want people to think, oh, he thinks that if you have a flip, you're automatically a good person. No, I don't think that. But I think if enough people flipped and we could develop cultures that prioritize what we share, I think we would be living in a much better world than we are now.
So the background is that the realization that we're all interconnected. Then you add another piece to it, which is the sort of ecological situation that we're in.
Well, it's not just that we're all interconnected. It's that we're all aware and that we all share in the same exact awareness. We can talk about why we're the same or why we're fundamentally all connected. It's not just we're all connected. Of course we are. We all breathe the same air and eat the same proteins and what have you. And then we die and our bodies become dirt. Of course, we're connected, but the flip is more than that. The flip is, no, I inhabit an interiority that is really not any different than the interiority that Angelo inhabits, or that any other human being on the planet inhabits. And once you come to that, not just that belief, but that experience, then I think you will behave and think and value in fundamentally different ways. That's the politics. And the way I put it is, try to make it contemporary. In our contemporary culture, again, we tend to think that our religious identities or our national identities are primary and our humanity is somehow secondary. And that's just not true. You or I are, as little infants, we could have been raised anywhere in the world and we'd be speaking a different language now and thinking and believing a different culture. A human being can become any of us. The cultural values and the religious beliefs are in fact secondary. They are in fact add-ons that end up shaping, yes, this humanity and making certain things possible and other things impossible, but they're not primary. They're just not. And so I think there is an ethics here and a kind of profound political future that we're not even close to. We're not even close to it.
Well, a follow-up has to do with the importance of the humanities. So maybe you could speak to that, and then we'll talk about the conference and the.
Well, yeah. I'm an inveterate creature of the humanities, it seems. By the humanities, I mean all of these subjects that study the interiority and meanings of human beings. So art, literature, religion, history, language, that kind of thing. And what we've value in this culture is the sciences, which turn everything into an object out there. And the humanities are all about subjects in here. And my argument is that the sciences are important, but they're no more important than the humanities, because I've met a lot of scientists, Angelo, and guess what? Every single one I've met is a human being. I've never met a scientist who wasn't a human being. And so there's something about science that is human. It's human before it's scientific. Our humanity is more basic. And if we can understand that humanity historically and morally and philosophically, again, I think we're just going to be way, way better off. I'll just give you a simple example. We have a program here called the Medical Humanities. It essentially teaches future doctors things like literature and ethics and history. And we try to make doctors better people. And the idea is simple. When you go to a doctor, guess what? You don't want to be treated like a biological machine. You want to be treated like a person. And you want your doctor to know the biology, right? And you want him to know a lot about the drugs that he's giving you, but you also want he or she to treat you as essentially a person and not just a machine.
As opposed to a specimen or something.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about this conference in the Archives of the Impossible. And I want to set it up again by your sort of audacious quote. You say, such a project is based on the wager that the new theory that has been hidden in the anomalous, that the paranormal appears in order to mock and shock us out of our present and normal thinking. Seen this way, psychical and paranormal phenomena can become the still, unacknowledged, unassimilated other of modern thought, the still unrealized future of theory, the fleeting signs of consciousness not yet become a culture. You're actually a good writer, which is not true of a lot of people in the academy. But in any event, what do you hope to the general question, what do you hope to do with this archive and this event?
I hope that the conference essentially acts as a kind of flag planted, in the academy and says to people, these things matter. These anomalous phenomena have tremendous potential, not just in the humanities with respect to religion and philosophy and history, but also with respect to biology and physics and engineering and astrophysics and everything else, that there's something about anomalous phenomena that want to be talked about. They want to shake us up. They appear not to be understood, but to confuse us and to push us into other ways of thinking and imagining. And so I want intellectuals, and it's not just intellectuals, Angelo. I know I'm an academic and I can sound like one a lot, but a lot of the best thinking actually about the anomalous doesn't occur in the university. It occurs in popular culture and in the interstices of different subcultures. And the thing about the university is that it can provide a kind of intergenerational space in which you can ask questions over many generations, and you can do it consistently and get things answered in a way you can't if they're just one-offs. And so I want to give this thing wheels, or I want to make it stick. I mean, we can use lots of metaphors. I just want people to take it seriously. And by seriously, I don't mean literally, but I do mean seriously. These are real events. These things really happen. Can we believe they're imaginal forms? No. Can we believe that they happened? Yes. So it's that third space that I'm trying to articulate. And, I've been talking about this for 10, 15 years now, both in the States and Europe. Before COVID, I traveled a lot. And my consistent discovery was that social scientists, humanists, natural scientists, people from all kinds of professions, psychiatrists, medical doctors, people in public, they generally have no trouble with this, but a lot of them are in the closet. They essentially don't know how to talk about it. They don't want to sound foolish, so they don't talk about it. And so we get to have this illusion that these are rare events or that these are things that shouldn't be talked about, when in fact they're not rare at all, and that everybody wants to talk about it. They just don't know how. And so I want to just talk. I want people to talk about it. It's not like I know how to talk about it or I have the answers. I don't. But I know that by talking about it, you encourage other people to talk about it, and then it kind of snowballs.
So maybe you can articulate some of the themes in this conference and also some of the people that will be there. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about them. So, I mean, off the top of my head, there's UFOlogy or whatever you want to call it. There's life after death. What are some of the themes and who are some of these people?
So, I mean, it's probably easiest to talk about the conference in terms of the plenary speakers, there's 7 of them, and there are donors, essentially. Most of them are donors. In other words, these are people who gave their life work to the archive and that we've archived and preserved. The first one is Jacques Vallée, who is a astronomer turned computer scientist turned writer of the UFO in the 1960s and 70s, probably the world's most famous UFO analyst today. And it was Jacques who began the archive by approaching me in 2014 and asking for help to place his papers in a university archive. And so I went back to Rice University and asked if we could do this, and it turns out we could. And so we negotiated with Jacques for a number of years and then received his papers. The second donor was Whitley Strieber, who gave us 6,000 letters that were written to him after his book Communion came out, 1987. Ed May is a physicist who helped run the remote viewing program for the federal government that different intelligence and military agencies contracted with in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Remote viewing is essentially a kind of it was a scientific protocol designed to study and encourage clairvoyance or psychical spying among the military. So they were training military professionals and public citizens to essentially spy on the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And the Soviets were doing this too, by the way. And then we have, people like Diana Pasulka, who gave us a UFO library, author of American Cosmic, another scholar of religion who's done amazing things looking at technology and the rise of the UFO in the 20th century, and also works with abductees. Leslie Kean, the New York Times journalist who helped break the stories in 2017 around the military radar and flying saucers, who has also written a lot about post-mortem survival of bodily death. And so Leslie's worked with us a lot, not just on the UFO collection, but also on our mediumship collection. A British medium named Stuart Alexander, gave us his own life work. And on down the road, John Philip Santos is a professor of Hispanic or borderland humanities in San Antonio. He's going to speak to the relevance of this material for understanding Mexican American cultures and borderlands and a kind of mestiza or mixed consciousness that results. Sebastiano de Filippi from Brazil is going to talk about the Latin American scene and how rich the paranormal is in Latin America and how it's being studied and talked about down there. Listen, before this last Omicron wave, we had about 100 people who were coming from Duke and Stanford and Harvard and Ohio State and University of Chicago and all over. Some of those people are still coming. Some of them are attending now virtually. And if you go to the website, which I hope you'll post in your site, however you post things, anyone can register for this event and attend the webinars in February and the plenaries in March, or they can simply come to the conference if they want to travel to Houston. So it's going to be it's a big deal actually. It's going to be large, and I hope it's going to be loud in a kind of media and intellectual sense.
Yeah, so how can people find out about it? Actually, I don't even know the URL of it. I'm sure I could find it out. But if somebody wants to find out about it, how might they find out about it? And how can participate in it?
We could just put the link on your website, right? Well, it's just impossiblearchives.org. And you go to the website and you literally register. And you can register there are 3 webinars in February leading up to the conference with Priscilla Wald of Duke University, Hussein Ali Agrama of the University of Chicago, and John Philip Santos of the University of Texas, San Antonio. So you can register for any of those events, and they're like this. It's a webinar. And then you can also register for the conference itself, which is March 3rd through the 6th, which is essentially the 7 plenaries in my opening remarks. Or you can register to come to the conference. So there's different options. And the website also has a series of posters on different alums we've trained in this field. It has my own narrative about how the archives of the impossible came about. So it has a lot of detail on there, John or Angelo, that will help your viewers do whatever they want to do with the conference.
Yeah, we're going to do a particular theme about the paranormal starting in February. So this was something that we can definitely spotlight.
Yeah.
So I wonder, so at the end of the day, it's going to be an archive where scholars and interested people can actually come and
well, it already
references.
is.
Yeah.
It already is, Angelo. I mean, we have been literally archiving this material with the professional archivists and my graduate students for 4 years now, since 2018. So not all of the archive is available yet, just because it takes time. I mean, you can't just magically produce. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of documents that were donated to us. So we can't get it all available instantly, but a lot of it is available, and anyone can come to the archive and work in it. It's open to the archive.
All right. Well, this is great. I myself cannot wait to participate. I'm looking forward to spreading the word, and I'll just tell people a little bit about the network. basically, you can, we have regular monthly events, which are by donation. You can join our private Facebook group. We have a private community that you can join, and I'll post links to that. And yeah, and if you want to help us out, you want to be a donor for us, you can do that too by going to Patreon and looking for Sacred Inclusion Network. Jeff, it's an enormous honor. I could talk to you all day. I have a whole bunch of questions which I didn't even get to, but I wanted to mostly just let people know about the conference, and we'll just see how it goes. I'm sure it's going to go great.